Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the organicmancoffeetrike.shop. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Had to quick unplug the phone. I've been getting an inordinate number of phone calls here lately. All telemarketers. Canada has surged ahead of the pack, with the United Kingdom close on their heels. Ghana is in third place, with the rest of the pack trying to get themselves sorted out. Bill, I hope you're doing better. I hate it when this happens, but it does. I had 2 interviews lined up for this week. One had to cancel due to work. We rescheduled. The other I'm still working on. Last time I had interview problems, we were getting ready to take a long trip up to Virginia. We're going to go see my nephew John and his family. I had 3 interviews lined up for 1 week. Well, the interviews all had to reschedule. Then they had to reschedule. And then they had to reschedule. Finally, none of the 3 interviews ever happened. I'm still wondering what happened. Anyway, I wound up having to come up with some shows to fill in the 2-week gap. And, things happen. That's life. That's the thing about dealing with other people. Sometimes their schedule and their life doesn't necessarily coincide with yours. Anyway, it did lead to me not doing a whole lot of interviews after that. I still do a few, just not as many. My dad talked about growing up on a farm. He worked a day and some nights to buy his first car. He used to tell about how he got stabbed in a riot. He had a 10-inch scar along his rib cage running from front to back, under his right arm. He would open his shirt and show off his wound at the strangest of times. We couldn't go anywhere without him bringing up the subject of his wound and then opening his shirt and showing off his scars. It was one of those things. Had he not gotten dragged into an emergency room and stitched up, I wouldn't be here today. Another of his favorite tales was the time he was laying bricks. He was 10 stories up in the air. The scaffolding collapsed. The men working, all their bricks, their mortar, all the building equipment, all came crashing to the ground 8 floors below. Lots of screaming and yelling as they went. Once on the ground, everybody crawled out from the mangled scaffolding, only to find that nobody was really hurt that bad. What will the legendary stories told in a few years be like? Some guy will tell about how he scored the highest ever playing a video game. How his parents bought him his first car. How nothing ever happened because there are so many safety devices and labels that nothing ever gets hurt. Let's face it, without some form of struggle, the stories of tomorrow are going to be really dull. August 1973, CB radio operators in California were shocked to receive a mysterious transmission from what sounded like a young boy pleading for help. The transmissions were at times difficult to understand because the boy was often crying or sobbing uncontrollably. And this, combined with the general poor signal and a lot of static, often made the messages nearly incoherent. The boy identified himself as Larry, a 7-year-old boy who was trapped in a vehicle. Being 7, he didn't really know where he was or how to get to him. He said his father had taken him rabbit hunting somewhere in New Mexico. While driving through the wilderness, they had run off the road into a ditch. The red and white pickup was wedged into a deep ditch, and neither door could open. To add to the distress, Larry said his dad was slumped over the steering wheel and he wasn't moving. He thought he might be dead. Years ago, nobody had a cell phone. If you drove a lot and you wanted some means of communicating, you had a CB, a Citizens Band Radio. There were some really good ones on the market and some that you couldn't send a signal across the street. Some folks would beef up the radios so they could broadcast all over the place. Most of us just had off-the-shelf models. No one wanted to use the real name, so everybody came up with a handle. Some cute and some downright nasty, but everybody had one. The FCC required that we all buy a license for our radios, and it had to be displayed on the back of the vehicle. Yeah, right. I never actually got around to buying the license. Very few people did. There were so many people all trying to talk, it was a miracle any information ever got out. Interference was a constant problem. Radios that were too far away to actually be understood, but you would still get their broadcasts, and that would interfere with people that were closer. It all depended on how strong the other guy's equipment was. Once the sun went down, the radio traffic went from bad to just plain impossible. Atmospherics can cause signals to travel great distances. Some folks would key the mic and start talking with absolutely nothing to say. If you kept the button down, it also interfered with other people's radios. It was like being in a room full of people all talking at the same time. Larry knew how to key the mic and talk, but not how to use the radio. He would switch channels right after pleading for help. The radio he was using had 23 channels to use, and he would just twist the knob and talk. The knob would go all the way around, no stop, so Larry would twist the knob and he would jump from channel to channel. He might go from channel 20 all the way to 3. CBs came with a speaker that was usually mounted right on the bottom. Then you could buy a much better speaker and mount it anywhere in your vehicle. If while the pickup was crashing into the gully, the wires got broken, the CB would no longer give a response. You could talk, but you couldn't hear. Anytime Larry let go of the mic, a lot of folks would try to respond to him. People wanted to help, no matter what. This led to a lot of useless chatter as everybody talked on top of each other. Larry had said they were in New Mexico. However, nobody knew for sure that that was where his dad had been when he hit the ditch. He was heading to New Mexico. That's all Larry knew. People in New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Utah, and Nevada could all hear the transmissions. Sometimes they were clear, while other times they were downright impossible to understand. Larry had said they were there in New Mexico somewhere, but nobody knew if that was where they were or not. He became known as Lost Boy Larry. As time ticked by, the transmissions began to grow fainter as the battery was being drained. If you just leave a CB radio on in a vehicle, it should take a few days before it'll drain the battery. When you key the mic, the drain gets more intense. The best guess is about 5 or 6 hours of nonstop transmission will drain a vehicle battery. How good a battery your vehicle has and how bad the CB radio you use all determine how long before you're off the air. It would seem that Larry would key the mic and talk and then switch from channel to channel listening. Or, as I said before, maybe the wires got pulled in the crash. The authorities were contacted, but they said it's a fake. Nothing to see here. Well, some search teams did go out having a look. All they had to go on was the best guess. Somewhere, maybe in New Mexico. Maybe there was a red and white pickup stuck in a ditch with a young boy in it, in need of rescue. No funds were being allocated for this search, so the search and rescue people were pretty much out there on their own. Most SNR people drove up and down the roads looking for anything out of the ordinary. The people who join search and rescue teams aren't the kind who like to sit back waiting for some desk jockey to tell them to go. There are folks walking the earth who should not be allowed off their leash. Some people thought it was funny to imitate Larry. They would key the mic and try talking as if they were him. They added all manner of description as to where the red and white pickup might be found. They would add sound effects like crying or animal noises in the background. People listening in couldn't tell who they were now listening to. This is like what happens when somebody runs into some cryptid somewhere. You have a few reports that are more than likely real, and then the fakes start to come out of the closet and just interfere with everything. The transmissions continued over several days, and they were picked up by a lot of CB radio operators. The signal was also fading in and out and often beset with a lot of static, either from some sort of atmospheric interference or just a low battery. In the 70s, there were somewhere around 20 million CB radios being used just in the United States. With only 22 channels available, since Channel 9 was only for emergencies, the airwaves were crowded. People too far from New Mexico to know what was going on would still use the radio, as they always did. The signals would wind up interfering with the SNR folks. As more people heard the story of the lost 7-year-old, the pressure was mounting on the authorities to do something. Finally, they did put out some funds, and they sent out more search parties, consisting of hundreds of people as well as numerous civilian and military aircraft, who scoured some remote areas of New Mexico from where it was believed that the transmissions could be originating. They turned up nothing. In the meantime, the story was picking up momentum in national news, with the chilling story of this poor lost boy trapped in a vehicle in the middle of nowhere, with time running out. Have you ever stepped out into a huge parking lot only to realize you don't remember where you parked? You have to walk around pushing the key fob, listening for the horn. Now, no such things back in the 70s. You're searching a parking lot. Imagine trying to find your vehicle somewhere in the city. or the county? Or how about the entire state? That's kind of like what the SNR folks had to deal with. A few people took to the air flying over promising areas and trying to spot the pickup. More SNR teams showed up and began scouring the brush. To add to the confusion, nobody could find anybody who knew of a 7-year-old named Larry who was missing. No worried mother had come forward saying that there was a problem. Would a mother be worried if she thought her son was with her husband on a hunting trip? Not everybody knew about the missing boy or the CB radio calls. Maybe she just never found out. Direction finders were brought in. There had to be 2 of them in order to find a triangulation on the spot of the radio. They both had to catch the same signal and triangulate where it was coming from. Come on, cat. Darn cats. I was going to lock them out of the studio, but then they sit at the door and holler. Anyway, the triangulation devices, the direction finders, they never caught a signal. Perhaps they were brought in too late. He'd either tired of trying the radio or the battery may have gone dead. Not wanting to say there was a 7-year-old boy lost out in the brush, the authorities announced that the whole thing was just a hoax. Nothing to see here. Go on about your business. Despite the official stance of a hoax, some of those who had actually spoken to Larry insisted it was genuine. One Army sergeant who said he had spoken with Larry for nearly 3 hours said the boy seemed to be in real trouble. If it was all an elaborate prank, no one has ever come forward saying that they were the one. There are some areas out there that few people ever visit. Was this all just a joke? Or did a young boy die sitting in the middle of nowhere waiting for rescue? The case remains an unsolved mystery. Only if or when somebody stumbles upon an old red and white pickup truck with 2 skeletons in it will this case ever actually be solved. A huge part of me hopes this was just a prank. That voice in my head, the reasonable one, says this actually happened. David Paulides is a former police officer who's now an investigator and a writer known very much for his books about Bigfoot and the missing 411 stories. David wrote about several accounts of people who made cell phone calls to friends or relatives just before they vanished. On a few of these cases, the call was cut off in mid-conversation. It was as if the person had stepped into some other dimension while talking. On a few occasions where the missing person is found, their phones are either not with them, or the batteries are dead, and sometimes just the battery is missing. Some of these folks, when they are found, they're missing items of clothing or one or both shoes. A few times they've found them where their shoes are on the wrong feet, or their shirts are buttoned up but not in the correct order of the holes. One case involved a 19-year-old college student named Brandon Swanson. You gotta like that name. On the evening of May 14th, 2008, Swanson had been out partying with friends in Minnesota. On the way home, he crashed his car into a ditch. Brandon was unable to get the car out of the ditch, so he called his parents around midnight, and he asked them if they could come pick him up. The parents drove to where he said he was, a small town, just outside of a small town called Lind. They arrived at the spot where he said he was, but they couldn't find their son or his car. They called Brandon and asked him if he was sure where he was. Brandon tried flashing the headlights on the car. Well, his parents tried flashing their headlights. Neither of them could see the lights blinking anywhere around them. After driving around up and down every side road they could think of and talking on the phone for about 45 minutes, Brandon said he was just going to walk into Lind and spend the night with a friend. He had a lot of friends in that town. His parents stayed on the phone a bit longer, and Brandon said that he could see the lights of the town in the distance and that he could hear running water. Suddenly he exclaimed, "Oh, shoot!" and the line went dead. His folks tried calling him back, but the line was completely dead. After driving back and forth some more, the parents called the sheriff's department. A search was launched involving hundreds of people and trained dogs. They combed the area around Lind. They couldn't find Brandon or his car. The search went on for 4 months, going through a 100-square-mile area without finding the missing man or even a trace of where he had crashed his car. The police did eventually find the car, but it was nowhere near where he had told his parents he was. Authorities were perplexed. Brandon had been traveling this same road for a long time. He was driving from his house to college and then back, just about every night of the week, for a year. He knew the area, and he had friends in town. His folks were convinced he was not incapacitated by drink or drugs. He'd sounded perfectly normal on the phone. How he could have gotten so confused as to his location couldn't be explained. He wasn't in a crash. He just drove into the ditch and got stuck. Why he told them he was in a ditch in one part of the road when he was actually in a completely different location made absolutely no sense. The authorities, once they found the car, said there was no evidence he had met with foul play. A search of his room and his history showed he had no desire to want to suddenly run away. He didn't have any unpayable bills. He didn't have any trouble at school. There was nobody that he was having problems with. A lot of theories have been proposed as to what became of Brandon, such as he fell into the river and was washed away, or that he met with some form of foul play. But one interesting fact to consider is that his last moment on the phone, the call seemed to have ended because the phone was deliberately hung up. There was his alarming exclamation of, "Oh, shoot," and the line went dead. Had somebody or something attacked him as he was talking to his parents, the sound of a struggle and the phone hitting the ground would have been heard. The line simply went dead. As soon as the line went dead, his mother immediately called back. Had the phone been damaged, the call would have gone to a phone center saying that the number couldn't be reached. Instead, all they heard was the sound of ringing. Searches over the years have failed to find any clues as to what happened to Brandon Swanson. The usual confusion did ensue. People saying that they saw him miles from where his car was, either walking or riding in another vehicle. None of these tips led anywhere. Authorities could find no record of his phone being used after that night. His credit cards were never used, and there are no credible witnesses ever coming forward as to his location. David Paulides also looked into a weird case involving William Hurley. William had moved from North Carolina to Quincy, Massachusetts to live with his girlfriend, Claire. On October 8, 2009, he went to a Boston Bruins hockey game with a close friend of his. After the first period, William told his friend he was really tired from working all day and he just wanted to head home. I guess the game wasn't that exciting. He said he was going to call Claire to pick him up outside the stadium. He did call Claire and he asked her to come get him, and then he paused, saying he wasn't quite sure where he was. Ever try to pick somebody up at a sporting event? You would have to drive all around the facility trying to find out where they are, unless they can give you a better location, like I'm at gate number 1 or entrance number 3 or something along those lines. As soon as William told Claire that he wasn't exactly sure of his location, a voice in the background could be heard saying, "You're at 99 Nashwood Street." In reality, the address was 99 Nassau Street, 1 block north of the arena. Claire got to the arena, the stadium, and she drove around looking for William. He told her his phone was just about to shut off because the battery was low. And then Claire heard the line go dead. As she kept driving, figuring he had to be somewhere in the area, Claire made the block and then pulled up in front of the building. She couldn't see William anywhere around the hockey arena. He said he was in front, and she was now sitting where he said he was. After waiting a few minutes, Claire began driving around some more, as she would stop and ask people if they'd seen her boyfriend. And she wasn't sure what he was wearing, but she knew what he looked like. How long would you wait before you called the police? Claire waited until she was convinced something must be wrong. Maybe he'd had a medical emergency. Maybe he got kidnapped. Try thinking of all the bad things that might happen to your loved one, and then stop thinking about them. It doesn't work. Claire called the police. The police showed up and they proceeded to do what Claire had been doing, driving around asking people if they'd seen William. They did find one bizarre clue. There was some crumpled debris laying in the street. After looking at it, they discovered it had been a cell phone at one time. The only way to determine if this was William's phone was by scraping up all the parts and having somebody sort through until they could find a serial number that could be read. It turned out that this was William's phone. 6 days later, William was pulled from the Charles River. His wallet and watch were still with him. There was no sign of a robbery attempt, and there was no sign that somebody tried kidnapping him and he escaped. This got me to wondering if maybe they found a smiley face painted on some bridge abutment somewhere. So I looked it up. The medical examiner found William had suffered blunt force trauma to his head, below his eye socket, and behind his left leg. Police theorized that an intoxicated Hurley had walked from the stadium parking lot at 99 Nashua Street to the river's edge and fallen into the water. Surveillance footage from outside the stadium captured Hurley stumbling and staggering, trying to maintain his balance. A toxicology report revealed that Hurley had a very low blood alcohol concentration, but there was GHB, the date rape drug, in his system. If you listen to the show Unsolved from 2 weeks ago, you'll know that GHB was found in many of the smiley face victims. Had William staggered down the street and fell into the Charles River, his body would have been found downstream from Nashua Street. His body was actually found upstream from where he should have fallen in. William's death was ultimately ruled an undetermined drowning, and investigators would later observe that Hurley was one of more than 10 young men who had mysteriously drowned in the Charles River within the same vicinity. Yes, it was listed as a smiley face murder, not officially, but it is on their website. June 12, 2005, a 22-year-old Todd Gibb was attending a bonfire gathering near his home that he shared with his cousin. The bonfire was in the middle of an orchard in Casanova, Michigan. After drinking some beer and talking to his friends, Gibb said that he was going to head home. He was going to walk since it was way less than a mile. He never arrived home. By the next morning, his cousin was worried, so he contacted the authorities. The police ran his phone records, and they found that Gibb had made a few phone calls from 12:47 to 12:57 in the morning. He'd called his friend and said something along the lines of, "I've had enough." Enough of what? Nobody knows. And then his last call was made at 12:57 when he announced that he was in the middle of a field. The line went dead. His friend called back, but the phone was unanswered. What sounded like heavy the phone was answered. What sounded like heavy breathing or gusting of wind could be heard, followed by the line going dead again. The phone was not used again after that, and there were no further calls afterwards. A massive search was mounted to try to find Gibb, including 1,500 police officers and volunteers, as well as aircraft. They searched the orchard and the area around the party site, as well as the stretch of road where he should have been walking if he was going to get home. The searchers found nothing. Not to be deterred, I keep getting those Daleks in my studio. Not to be deterred, the search party went over the same area a second time. Well, after finding nothing the second time, they went over the area a third time. Now, we're not talking people just wandering around looking under bushes. We are talking well-trained search and rescue people who are looking for a missing man. They know how to look. Planes flew back and forth over the area many times. They couldn't find Gibb. July 2nd, 2005, 3 weeks after he'd gone missing, Gibb's body was found. The body was found in a pond right in the middle of the area that the searchers had completely and thoroughly combed 3 times. The searchers had walked around and flown over this pond many times. The body was found when Gibb's head was spotted sticking up out of the water. He was standing upright in the middle of the pond. I have seen some bodies in weird positions in my time. I have never found one standing up in the water. For a body to remain in such a position, it would seem to me like it would have to have been dropped from above. An autopsy was conducted on Gibb's body, and it was found that he had no external injuries, but he did have a blood alcohol content of 0.12. leading authorities to rule it an accidental drowning while under the influence of alcohol. A 0.08% is considered legally drunk. At 0.12, the person is going to begin throwing up. They'll be drowsy. They'll display emotional instability, loss of critical judgment, impairment of perception and memory and comprehension. Lack of sensory-motor coordination and impaired balance are typical. In other words, they're falling down drunk. Well, the case was closed. Gibb had been drunk, staggered into the pond, and drowned, standing up. Gibb's family questioned why he would have suddenly decided to take a swim in the pond fully clothed, and why did it take so long to find his body? A forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Sikrika, was hired as an independent examiner. He found, after careful analysis of the photos and autopsy data, that while Gibb had been missing for 3 weeks, he appeared to have only been dead for 2 to 5 days. It was also determined that Gibb had no water in his lungs, and there were many clues that pointed to the body being placed in the water after death. This was corroborated by other experts, and all strongly pointed to the possibility that Gibb was in fact murdered. Michigan State Police have never reopened the case, much to the consternation of Gibb's family. The bizarre phone conversations added a more mysterious slant to the whole thing. Nobody ever had any reason to suspect Gibb was unhappy with any aspect of his life. He wasn't in financial problem. He didn't have difficulties with his girlfriend or anybody else. Nothing going on at work. What was it he had had enough of that nobody could figure out? May 2013, a former star college football player, Cullen Finnerty, was away on a Memorial Day weekend fishing trip on the Baldwin River in Michigan. At one point during his trip, Finnerty made a bizarre call to his wife in which he claimed he was being followed and he was frightened. He was breathing heavily, and he made a rather weird proclamation to his wife. He said he was taking off all of his clothes, without saying why. Shortly after saying this, the phone went dead. This was the last time anybody spoke with him. Finnerty did not return from the fishing trip as planned, and a search was launched. During the search efforts, Finnerty's phone was pinged several times to try to find his location. Each time the phone was pinged, it was found to be far from where it had been just a few minutes ago. It looked as if Finnerty, or at least his cell phone, was moving around. The searchers were still unable to find the missing man. May 28, 2013, Finnerty was finally found dead in the woods about 1 mile from where his boat was found. Not very far from a busy road. The body showed no signs of trauma or external injuries, and he had been well dressed for the conditions. Why Finnerty had told his wife he was taking off all of his clothes made no sense. No reason could be found for his death. The area Finnerty had been found had already been searched. People out looking for the missing man had walked through the area his body was later found in. An autopsy was conducted, but the original results were inconclusive, only able to ascertain he had no signs of drugs in his system and a very small amount of alcohol. There were no external injuries such as cuts, scratches, or bruises. A second autopsy conducted by the Kent County Medical Examiner's Office, came to a conclusion that Finnerty had likely died from complicated combination of factors. Since he had been a football player, he had sustained numerous concussions throughout his career, which they said led to a condition known as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the symptoms of which can include disorientation, confusion, memory loss, which may have contributed to his strange call just before his death. He was also found to be taking painkillers, oxycodone, for back injury. The final autopsy results were that he had most likely become scared, panicked, and confused while alone in the woods, which had been exacerbated by the oxycodone and his brain trauma, and that at some point he had inhaled his own vomit, which had led to his death. Had the second autopsy been correct, the first medical examiner should be investigated. How was the oxycodone missed? No drugs had been found in his system in the first autopsy. Now, oxycodone does have a very short lifespan while in the bloodstream. In most cases, it can be thoroughly removed within 3 to 5 hours of the drug's ingestion. However, for a heavy user, or those with specific circumstances, it can take up to 20 hours before the drug is fully out of the body and no longer detectable. If a person takes the drug and then falls over dead, the drug is still going to be there. Did somebody in a high position not want the death to be looked into? Did somebody with connections want the death to be ruled an accident so it would simply go away? A 30-year-old social worker, Kayleen Louder, went missing in Murray, Utah, September 2014. In the days leading up to her disappearance, Louder made several strange 911 calls. In one, she called 911 and excitedly claimed there was a fight that had broken out in a wedding, and the combatants had weapons. They had guns. But later, when the police arrived, they determined there were no guns, there was no fight. There was nothing. Another time she called 911, which she claimed there were intruders in her apartment, as she could be heard screaming at them to get out of her house. Her roommate was at home at the time, and she could be heard in the background trying to convince Louder there was nobody there. During the call, Louder told the 911 dispatcher that she could not see the intruders, but she could hear them talking in the other room. The roommate could be heard telling Louder that the bolt is still locked and there is nobody inside. Louder said that somebody was there and that they must have a key to unlock the door. Her roommate said, no, the door is still locked. Throughout the call, no matter how rational the roommate tried to convince her that there was no intruder, Louder wouldn't listen. She kept saying, there's somebody in the apartment. Police arrived at the scene, and they determined there was nobody there but the two roommates. There was no sign of a break-in, and there was no sign of intruders, no sign of anything. Adding to her strange behavior leading up to her vanishing is a piece of surveillance footage from the day before she disappeared, showing Louder walking her dog and talking to someone, either herself or somebody off camera, although it was pointed out that she could have been talking to her dog. I talk to my dog all the time. I talk to my cats as well. As long as I don't hear them actually answering me, I'm doing okay. September 27th, 2014, Louder left her apartment in the middle of a heavy rainstorm. As she was barefoot, wearing a tank top and shorts, She didn't take her wallet or her keys, or any other belongings. It was the last time anybody ever saw her alive. Searchers were unable to find any trace of where she had gone until a month later. November 30th, 2014, Louder's decomposing body was found partially submerged in the Jordan River, 5 miles from her apartment. The discovery of her body only deepened the mystery. Detectives at the scene were unable to figure how her body could have gotten to the location where it was found. Although the body was found to be covered with moss and leaves and other detritus from the river, it was determined that the water level and the flow could not possibly have carried her body as far as it had gone. Adding layers of mystery to the case is the autopsy took longer than it should have. When it was finally released, several months later, the results were determined to be inconclusive. The cause of her death was unknown. A suicide was suggested, although Louder had experienced a bit of depression due to recently losing her job, as she was described by friends and family as being well-adjusted and not having any difficulties that could have led to her suicide. The bizarre calls she had made seemed to point to a mental breakdown of some sort, but Louder had no history of mental illness, and the victim's mother said her daughter had been acting normal leading up to her disappearance. If she had wanted to commit suicide by throwing herself into the river, how had she been carried 5 miles away when it was determined that the creek leading from the apartment to the river couldn't have carried her there? Did she walk 5 miles in the pouring rain, barefoot, just to throw herself into the river? It all seemed a bit strange. Louder's family seemed to agree, claiming that authorities didn't want to do a thorough enough autopsy, and that she was murdered. Louder's cousin, Amy Fugel, said the police have told us from the beginning they don't expect foul play. And we feel completely the opposite. We kind of feel like we are left to figure this out on our own. Louder's death remains a mystery as to how she died, why she'd left her apartment barefoot during a downpour, and what significance those weird 911 calls and surveillance footage had in relation to her disappearance and death. This reminds me a whole lot of what happened to Lisa Lam. Amber Tucaro was a 20-year-old Indian, feather, not dot, from Alberta's Mikisaw Cree First Nation, and she lived at Fort McMurray with her mother. August 2010, Amber made a stopover in Nisku, Alberta, Canada. She had her 14-month-old child with her and a friend. She was on her way to Edmonton. August 18, 2010, Amber was seen getting into an unidentified vehicle near the motel where she was staying, and the vehicle drove away. When Amber had not returned by the next morning, the authorities were contacted and a search turned up no sign of what had happened to her. She had simply disappeared. The authorities were of the opinion she had gone out partying with someone and would eventually turn up in a few days. This led to a slow response to the investigation until the case was already a few days old. 10 days later, August 28th, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, released a potential piece of the puzzle in the form of Amber's last known phone conversation. During the rather disturbing call, Amber can be heard talking with somebody in the background. The RCMP believed that this might have been the vehicle's driver, as well as the person who killed her. As she tells the person, "You better not be taking me anywhere I don't want to go." To which a man's voice responds that he was taking them north to 50th Street, which Amber repeats to the person on the other end of the line, after which the call cuts off suddenly. Towards the end of the call, Amber is described as sounding scared, although the male voice seems calm and normal. September 1st, 4 days after the audio recording was released, Amber's remains were found by some horseback riders in the rural area of Ladue County, in the general vicinity of where she had vanished. The finding of the body put renewed urgency on the identity behind the voice talking to Amber in the recording. Yet, no new tips came forward, and her killer remains a mystery. People began asking why it took 10 days for the authorities to release the recorded phone call. The RCMP said it's not customary for them to release audio material to the public during a homicide investigation, but in this case, the frustrated authorities had made an exception in the hopes that somebody might recognize the voice and aid them in their investigation. A question I had while reading this case came up as well. The RCMP refused to disclose how they had obtained a recording of the last call that Amber had made. Well, an independent investigation by the CBC News uncovered that she had been speaking to her brother, who was in the Edmonton Remand Center, better known as jail, at the time, where it is common procedure to record all incoming and outgoing calls from inmates. Ever since John Kirk retired, I no longer have a connection with the RCMP. Not that I would ask him about an ongoing murder case. I already know that he wouldn't answer. It was just kind of cool to be able to say, I know somebody in the Mounties. Like how I used to be able to tell people I was on a first-name basis with the chief of police and the chief of the fire department here in Laredo. Well, they both have since retired, and it didn't do me any good anyway. The chief of police told me he didn't want to hear about any tickets I got. Well, I don't get tickets hardly ever, so didn't do me any good. The CBC also said the RCMP only released 61 seconds of the audio when the entire recording was 17 minutes long. You have to ask, how much audio do you need in order to identify a voice? A murder investigation always holds back certain information so they can weed out those people that are going to confess to crimes they didn't do. Well, Amber's family were vocal about what they thought was going on and how they thought that the case was being mishandled. They said that 3 different women came forward during the investigation and told the RCMP that they recognized the voice on the recording. One woman was absolutely positive she knew who it was. She said, "I know that voice. I've ridden with that voice before on several occasions. There's no doubt in my mind that it's his voice. I know that voice like the back of my hand." Why she didn't put a name to the voice, I don't know. Or maybe she did and the RCMP hung on to it. According to the family, the 3 women came forward similarly saying they knew the owner of the voice, and yet the RCMP supposedly only checked out 1. Once again, we don't have the details of the investigation. Maybe they did investigate all 3 and couldn't find anything. Investigators took Amber's name off their missing persons list 1 month after she'd gone missing. Amber's mother, Tootsie Tucero, pitched a fit until the RCMP investigators put her name back on the list. All of Amber's belongings that had been collected from the motel room that may have been used as evidence in court were destroyed. Was this an oversight, or did they determine that the killer had never been in the motel room and there was no reason to hold on to things any longer? To me, any kind of evidence in a homicide should be held on to until the case is put to bed, as in, the killer stops breathing. I did a show called Canada Mysteries back in February 2021. In it, I talked about what is known as Highway 16 West, also known as the Highway of Tears. 18 to 22 women have gone missing along this one stretch of road in Canada. The bodies of 4 other women were found in the vicinity of where Amber was found. The possibility of these cases being related should put some fire under somebody's backside. The phrase serial killer comes to mind, but the folks holding the purse strings grow ill at the thought of public outcry, leading to massive piles of cash being spent on cases that they don't consider high priority. Nobody they know is missing or dead, so therefore they don't want to spend a lot of money on a bunch of people they don't know. Unfortunately, that is the nature of the beast. October 8th, 2015, Karen McCabe checking her voicemail when she found a bizarre message. As she was in California at the time and was checking her voicemail at 2:30 a.m. The message she got was from her husband's phone. He was in Spring Lake Park, Minnesota. The voicemail was 2 minutes of moaning, groaning, screaming, growling, followed by somebody saying, "Stop it." Her husband, 31-year-old Henry McCabe, went out to a nightclub in Spring Lake Park on the evening of September 7th, 2015, and he vanished. I managed to listen to the voicemail. It wasn't too disturbing, but it sounded like somebody was in pain, and maybe at the hands of someone else. It's amazing what you can find on the internet these days. Yes, they have a recording of this weird phone call that Karen received. The last person to have seen Henry McCabe was his friend who had been with him the night drinking at a nightclub. The friend said he dropped Henry off at a local gas station convenience store near the club, and that was the last time he'd seen him. Police and volunteers thoroughly searched the area but could find no sign of McCabe. The location of the final call was determined to be nowhere near where the friend said he'd dropped McCabe off. The phone had originated from the vicinity of Rice Creek Park near Brighton, which is about 5 miles northeast from where the convenience store was. A search of that area came up empty. No signs of Henry were found. November 4th, 2015, McCabe's body was discovered floating in Rush Lake near Brighton, and an autopsy came to the conclusion that he had drowned. His cell phone was found in his pocket. The battery was in another pocket. It is unclear just how McCabe ended up in the lake or whether there was foul play involved. The case is considered to be unsolved and ongoing. The bizarre part is that the findings of McCabe's drowned body doesn't seem to consist with what was heard on the voicemail by his wife. In that recording, the indecipherable jumble of garbled growls, moans, grunts suggests some form of violence is being inflicted on him, And one investigator even said the growls turn into a high-pitched moan like he's in pain. Yet McCabe's body didn't show any signs of trauma or injury. Very little of the case seems to make sense, and authorities have not been able to come to a conclusion on what the disturbing voicemail means, or even if the moans and other noises are from McCabe or someone else. It is possible that this recording holds some clue as to what happened to him, and audio analysts are still working on it. But for now, the case of Henry McCabe, his mysterious disappearance, and bizarre phone call remain a mystery. Think about the last phone call you got from somebody you know. What exactly did they say? Can you remember the conversation word for word? Most of us will never have to try racking our brains trying to figure out if a phone call or voicemail is a lead in a murder case. At what point does a weird phone call become a clue to an investigation? I played that weird phone call that I received, that weird recording I received some time ago. But I'm going to play it again, so those of y'all that didn't catch the show can listen and try and figure out what the heck is being said, or what's going on.
You have one old message. Sunday, 9:02 p.m. End of messages.
I played that on the show several months ago, and I still haven't figured out what the heck that means. And next time the phone rings and you're about to hit that answer button, just think, will this be some telemarketer trying to sell you an extended warranty for your vehicle? Or could it be something else? Something bizarre? Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell your friends and neighbors that they need to listen up as well. If you'd like to buy one of my books or a t-shirt, that would be much appreciated. Can always use the money to hopefully make the show better. T-shirts can be found at tpublic.com, and my books are all available at the Organic Man Coffee Trike on McPherson, or you can get them at amazon.com. Bill, I hope you're listening, and I hope you're doing better.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?